for information purposes. Oh, here we go again. So we're looking for approval of the agenda on that basis as amended. Joyce, a seconder. Rob, yep. All in favor? Thank you. That's passed. Adoption of point 2 or 2.1 is the minutes from January 11th, 2022 Finance Advisory Committee meeting. And we're looking for a recommendation that the minutes of the Financial Advisory Committee meeting held on January 11th be adopted. Mover and seconder?
Actually, I had a question about those minutes. So I received a copy of the draft and was uncomfortable with some of the, I believe there was text added to kind of explain this consultation thing, but it wasn't necessarily said at the meeting. And I think, Fred, I reached out and sort of said
I think I can respond to that particular point before we address the minutes. Everything that was included, John, are things that I did bring forward in the meeting. I had my own notes and I was quite specific about identifying things. The only item that I think is probably not correct, I made a reference to a $4.26 million shortfall. And I think that amount is actually less than that because of monies that were already spent in the current year and taken from current sources. But I had taken that number from public information that was provided. So other than that, each of the points, John, I kind of did. I thought I had brought forward specifically. I tried not to editorialize, but rather state facts, I guess, basically overall. So I wasn't trying to make a lot of side comments or evaluations. I think that was the position I took on that.
Okay.
Thank you. And are you okay with that?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Again, my only comment is I think we should, the 4.26 million as stated is not really an accurate number. I just say that there is a shortfall and leave it at that. In terms of that point. Is there any other comments or questions in regards to the minutes of January 11th? So we had a mover. Michael, I think you moved.
I did.
So let's have a seconder, please. Joyce, thank you. All in favor? Thank you very much. And those points are passed. Thank you. We're now moving on to point 3, public comments. Steph, is there anything? Thank you. Point 4, sorry, Liam?
Chair, this isn't necessarily a public comment, but I'm remiss in, I should have done this at the beginning. I wanted to introduce Quinn Buchanan, because I don't think Quinn has been to one of these meetings before. Quinn is our accountant and joined us last year, but has not actually been to a Finance Advisory Committee meeting before. And so,
okay. Well, welcome, Quinn.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should have noticed that too. But anyway, that's fine. Thank you. Anyway, action items 4.1. We've identified that Liam provided a report to committee members this afternoon. I think that's really intended as an information item at this point in response to that request. Liam, I don't know if you want to say anything to it or just kind of it provides a background and may lead to some further discussion down the road.
Yeah, I do want to just say there was a specific request to confirm that that DCCs can be applied retroactively to infrastructure that is built before a DCC is collected. And so I provided a link to the DCC guide from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and highlighted the sections and copied the exact sections from the guide that expressly identify that is possible. And in additional to that, you can also recover long-term debt interest charges. So typically you can't with a DCC. DCCs allow you to recover short-term or construction debt interest charges, but long-term debt is typically restricted except for some specific exemptions, which would include things like a wastewater treatment plant. And so there's more details in there, but essentially this just provides the precise evidence to support that we can go forward with the DCC and then build something and then apply those DCC contributions in a future date towards that asset that we've already built.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions?
When did you send that out? I read the whole thing, but I can't find it in my inbox now.
It's from me.
It came from
Oh, it's
Steph.
from Steph.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Here it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a couple of, when you say, damn it, I didn't highlight. There seems to be some sort of contrary statements in here. As a matter of ministry policy, inflation and long-term debt financing are not considered eligible for DCC recovery. And then it goes on and says, however, section 935 bracket 3 bracket C of the LGA does allow funds in DCC reserve accounts to be used to pay for the interest and principal on a debt resulting from DCC projects. So that's sort of a little bit of contradictory. So when they say money in DCC reserve accounts, is that money gathered before the project happens or money put into the DCC reserve accounts after the project happens?
Yeah, that was my question.
You can go with either way, but basically what they're saying there is that typically they don't allow for long-term debt interest to be an eligible recoverable cost for DCCs. Except for there's a few exemptions, and they go on to identify that like a wastewater treatment plant or drinking water treatment or those types of projects. There's the types of projects where you as a municipality would have to invest in that project in order to support the growth that you're doing the project for. So you have to build it and then they will come, so to speak.
Yeah, but I guess part of what's being asked for us for DCCs is, I guess, so the whole question is going to boil down to what area are you going to collect the DCCs from? Right.
And so for example, we're working on a DCC bylaw as directed by council for the sewer area, which would be limited to the sewer area. And yeah, we can also use, and so those DCCs would be applied to new development that's occurring.
Then we get into the definition of new development. Is new development of building a single family house on a lot that's already been in the service area for 20 years?
Well, we haven't fully defined what we would want our DCC bylaw to demonstrate as new development. And so typically if you're a lot that's already zoned appropriately and within the service area, that would be not new development. But we can use, and we would like to use latecomer agreements as well. So it's not that we would limit the recovery tools to DCC, like we can use a variety of different tools to finance capital upgrades.
So all those reports that we had done by Urban Systems starting in 2011 and then going up to a council presentation in 2015, we're supposed to cover off all of that information. And
maybe.
All right, so I'm still up in the air and lots of questions. So
I think maybe for the purposes of our discussion today, it's probably appropriate. There's a matter at hand that does require addressing specifically, and I think the role of the committee really is to look at options, money options or finance options that will allow that situation to be addressed, rather than dwelling on how we got here. I think we are where we are, and for our purposes of our committee's focus is to look at how we deal with this situation as it currently stands. And I think Allison's is a really good point around the types of situation or type of reviews that will be required as we look at phase 2 of the project, in terms of having a financial model that works and one that's equitable for taxpayers, and also would obviously include the points that we've just talked about. So I think it's a good longer-term perspective, but probably something that will be addressed at some point in the future, but we have an immediate matter at
So
hand.
for the purposes of today's conversations, the DCC is not being considered by staff as something that could solve phase one problems.
No, I think that addresses that point. Yeah, John.
Now, are we still on item 4.1 old business, or are we on item
Well,
5?
we're kind of on 4.1. Yeah.
Just so thinking of item 5 and this DCC, I mean, it's a very small tool to help us. I mean, if we even get another 20 connections,
Yeah, exactly.
at 20,000 a connection, which is probably quite high, that's only $400,000 cash being raised for a potential $7 million problem.
No, but the phase one is where I'm not, that's what I think I'm trying to clarify.
Yeah,
Okay.
phase one is basically the
There's two
1,640,000.
phases, and if the DCC is considered a way to raise money to pay off whatever we would do for phase two, that's fine to defer it. If it's going to be considered as a source of funding to deal with phase one, then it needs to fall into our conversations today.
Yeah, and I think we can address that in due course. But right now, as I said, it's phase one is our issue at hand.
Right.
And our options that may exist under that. That was just my comments going into, I guess, 5.1 in terms of the Snug Cove wastewater treatment plant upgrades. And I'm not sure, I'll defer to Liam and to Patrick regarding what points you'd like to bring forward on that. We've all had a chance, I know, to review the reports.
So actually, that's a good question, Fred, because I want to make the best use of our time here today. And so if everybody has reviewed the materials and or watched the committee of the whole, then I would suggest that we could save time by not representing and move into effectively move into questions and or looking at options. And I do want to also draw attention to folks that you know, there is section 6 of the agenda, which is where we would move to a close, where we would be speaking to some budgetary items and some more details that need to be done in the closed section. So.
Okay, thank you, Liam. Is everybody comfortable with that in terms of the information that's provided?
Definitely.
So I think at this point, I would open it to any questions that members of the committee would like to direct towards Liam or to Patrick.
Rob.
Rob, sorry.
Yeah,
Rob?
thanks for. Yeah, just a question to Liam, and we talked briefly about this at our last council meeting, and I read the DCC and I had the same question Allison had, the confusion between how we can use that. But for this phase one, but also moving ahead into phase two, how are we moving to a system where the people that are on that system are paying for that and capital costs and all included? And I think we all, you know, like when if my septic goes, I got to pay out 40 grand. I'm not getting any, funds from the muni, obviously, to help me with that. And the question out in the community is, I'm covering that, and now I'm also going to be, through my taxes, covering really people's septic in the Cove there. And I just want to see us move to, I don't know if you want to call it equitable or whatnot, but to a system where a more of a user pay system that is within the zone that obviously the users are, and not bringing in outside money that probably would have been going to other projects.
Right. It's a very good question, Rob, and we've talked about it with council in the past and not just on Monday night, but earlier too. And we most definitely want to move to a model whereby it really is user pay. But that line is not as crisp as we would like it to be. It almost never is. And in this scenario, what we're running up against is that the users of the system have paid for the system that they currently enjoy. But any excess capacity that was built into the system has been consumed. And so there is no additional capacity to accommodate any new additions to the system. And compounding the problem is we have not charged any of the most recent connections to the system in any way to cover off a capacity expansion at the treatment plant. So that's the problem that we face today, is that we have no capacity and no funds set aside in that specific reserve for the sewer area to accommodate an expansion. And so for me, I then go, okay, well, where did that capacity go? And what happened to it? And, some of it is from, inflow and infiltration, but that's naturally occurring. So that's not going to be the bulk of it. The bulk of it was from other developments that municipal council in the past had made a decision that they would waive the fees and charges for that capacity. And so, and those were, good projects like that. Council chose to waive those fees. However, what wasn't presented to council at the time was an option for, well, where would the funds for that waiver come from? Because you can't just waive it entirely without ending up in the situation that we're in. And so going forward, what I would like to see is that when council is being asked to consider waiving a fee for a development, regardless of the merits of that development, like housing is definitely a good, perhaps candidate for a waiver, like a rental housing unit or something like that. Then I would also ask staff to present, okay, well, if council waives those fees have to come from somewhere. And so right then and there, we would specify where those fees are coming from. And if it's a project that seems that it's benefiting the broader community, then that's justifiable for those fees to come from general revenue, as was the case in 2010 when the plant was expanded back then. And I think as is the case now. However, phase 2, we really are looking at much more brand new development. And so to me, we need to build in that new model of how we charge and how we consider waivers and the like, so that when we're advancing beyond this current phase, that we have a proper model in place so that we're recovering the fees appropriately. And
how would we recover fees? Because I get the development cost and the hookup fees, but I mean, 20,000, it doesn't, when you're looking at 5-7 million, whatever total in, that's not going to make a big dent in that. But what about existing users on the system? Obviously, we weren't charging enough for the replacement of that. Are we going to be upping those charges, or how are we going to recover the cost there?
Yeah, I think with all of the utilities, we have to really look at the actual replacement cost. So I don't think for any of the utilities on the island, we're charging the appropriate rates for capital renewal and replacement. So we have to look at all of them. Even for our roads, which is not a utility, we're not charging the right rates for that either. So we have to look at all of our fees and charges and look at the true capital renewal and replacement to get us to a better, more sustainable financing model. Okay. And so and just want to add one point to that is that I also don't think that it's necessarily fair for the service area to have to pay for all of these upgrades and increased capacity for new development either. So I do think the burden does have to be shared.
Okay, thank you. And I think this is a great opportunity as a time for reset, because we're at a position, as Liam identifies, no capacity and no money. So we're kind of starting fresh in some ways for the next phase. Allison, your hand is up.
Yeah, I guess there's two things in my mind. One is we've got an existing system with existing users, and they should be putting into reserve funds enough money to maintain the existing system. And then you've got the desire to expand the system. And those people I will call new benefiting partners. And somehow we have to figure out a way to get the money from those new benefiting partners to pay for the sewer expansion. And that's a whole separate discussion which deals with phase 2. Is there any costs in phase 1, Patrick, that are repairs and maintenance to the system?
No, not really. The only aspect of the overall phase 1+2 expansion that you would call capital replacement is the a portion of the outfall replacement. So the outfall.
I thought that was in phase 2.
Yeah, it is in phase 2. That's really the only capital replacement component. I mean, you could make an argument that some aspects, so where we have to install a new generator, the increased electrical load requires a new generator. You could argue a portion of the cost of replacing that generator is attributable to the capital replacement of the current generator, which has a certain, age and, remaining service life. But we haven't looked into that level of detail on, sort of justifying a capital replacement component for phase 1. Essentially, it's all for additional capacity.
Okay.
Patrick, you and I haven't had a chance to discuss this, so you might want to kick me under the table if you could. But I would like to make an argument, though, that for the phase 2 component, there may be, for me, I do think that there is a contribution from the existing users that is legitimate, or because part of the issue is that we're bumping up against these regulatory requirements that are requiring us to improve the effluent quality and the capacity of the plant. And so, as the community grows, we need to expand the capacity of the plant to accommodate those new benefiting parties, as Councillor Morse calls them. But is it legitimate for those new benefiting parties to bear the entire cost of that? Or can some of the existing users, or can the existing users also be considered required to contribute? I think there has to be a bit of analysis and digging in on that to determine, well, what is a justifiable expense for the upgrading of the system to meet regulatory requirements for the existing users versus the net new users. And so I don't think to me, it's justifiable that the existing users will need to contribute to that phase 2 portion. But we have yet to figure out the math on that and to determine that. But we are exploring a financing strategy to accommodate phase 2, but it's going to take quite a bit of time.
Yeah, and I think we've said that today we're really focusing on the phase 1 requirement right now. Yeah. I just want to check before I move to Michael. Rob, you've had your hand up for a while.
No, I'm good. I'm done.
Maybe not, take it off, please.
Need to lower your hand.
Lower your hand.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Michael?
Fred, I'm all for moving on. I hope we record. I think I've heard in the last 5 minutes from Councillor Morse and Liam some of the clearest thinking on this situation that I've heard since this debate began. So I'm going to ask that Steph, if necessary, particularly records the minutes of the last 5 minutes, because I think all the points put into a very remarkable and simple perspective that everyone can understand. The present situation, the future situation, who will largely have to step up to the plate right now, who will have to step up to the plate in the future, and that there will be elements in the future that will affect various different parties. For example, if there was no change and no additions, that plant would have to be upgraded probably to meet new standards, and therefore those upgrades would have to be met by the current users. So I think, and I thank you, Fred, because this committee has brought a remarkable focus on this over the last few minutes, which I think we should I'm going to ask Steph I want to get this down in writing and to move it forward as we can move forward now on the present. But I think it's explained it with remarkable clarity. So thanks to all.
Thank you, Allison, and then John.
I should know, maybe I should let John go first.
Okay.
I've been
Thank you.
talking a lot.
Whatever you like.
Thank you, Allison. Well, looking at the perspective now from a finance committee, I guess, is the Muni is undergoing quite a growth phase in terms of spending. The fire hall, the community center, and the water treatment plant, various things all happening. It's quite a call on funding, and will be maybe for operation in the future. And then the other thing is we're in sort of an emergency situation right now. In other words, yes, it was forecast a year or two ago something would need to be done with this treatment plant, but for whatever reason, we just very quickly came up to this wall, and it's very unusual to suddenly deny connections. So we're in an emergency situation. And to my mind, we can talk about phase 1, phase 2 and recovery, but in a sense, we're looking at how to get out of this current emergency and not use up valuable funds that need to go to other things. And as Rob has pointed out, also blend fairness with people that have septic fields versus people who are in the Cove. But Michael, I guess there's some clarity, but I'm sort of more concerned about, it's 1.6 million now, and then total 7 million later, we don't know, right? Because the later part. And then the other thing that I find a bit concerning is we're sort of saying, oh, growth will cover the cost. But really, if there's 100 connections now, and maybe 120 in the short term, but we're not talking about another 100 connections coming on in the next few years, I would think, unless the OCP clearly shows, like normally in an OCP process, you project growth and then you project the infrastructure needed to service the growth. And does the OCP right now envision 100 or 150 more connections? Because that's what you need to pay back all this cost.
Okay, we'll go to Liam before we go to Allison.
Right, John, good question. I don't know the specific numbers that the OCP specifies for growth in the Cove, but that does specify that all the predominant growth on the island should occur in the Cove. And so it's the OCP does focus densification and growth to occur in the Cove. If we look at what we know is like in play for development potential in the sewer area or immediately adjacent to it, that you would actually want them to connect to the sewer, you easily surpass 100 in a 20-year time period. So one of the things that we keep our eye focused on, and I don't want to create any alarm bells, but this is the sort of due diligence of the municipality, is we keep our eyes on areas of concern as well, like Deep Bay, right? And that's a neighborhood that's quite old with very old septic systems, many of which are possibly questionable in their ability to function in the way that they should. So at some point, we are factoring in the need to connect Deep Bay as well. That's, who knows when that really is. We're also looking at a big development proposal that we don't know real numbers around, but we've had initial preliminary discussions with Bowen Island Properties about Parkview Slopes, or otherwise known as the Shire. And that's quite a significant amount of connections. There's other development potential that's in the Cove already that's in the sewer area. And so in interest of confidentiality of those developers' interest, I can't speak to them all, but we know that within the Cove, there's also other opportunities for redevelopment of properties that they have not maximized their allowable zoning or limits right now. So when we factor all of these things in and we're projecting out, we could easily surpass that 100 mark that you speak of. And so as a municipality, we want to plan for that so we don't find ourselves in this situation where we're having to throw up a wall and say no. And so it's not difficult, even in the near-term growth beyond this initial phase, to start getting into numbers that if we had a DCC, we would generate, significant revenue to support an expansion. Chair, I'd like to just take 2 minutes and give my little sort of elevator pitch of how I see phase 2 unfolding, because that might answer.
Because we're kind of spending most of our time really talking about phase 2 rather than the current situation.
So we need to dig into it deeper, but essentially we've got a cost estimate for phase 2, and we know that the likelihood of generating sufficient funds to finance phase 2 is going to take some time. It might take 5 years. So let's take that cost estimate and do some forecasting of escalation and inflation and get a forecasted number for what it would be 5 years from now. Call it 7 million, just for argument's sake. Then what we need to do is we need to meet with the development community that we know is interested in development in and around the sewer area. And we need to discuss with them, okay, well, if we take the cost estimate for the sewer capacity and we divide that by the number of units, this is what the DCC charge would be. And is that something that you can factor into your pro formas and still make a viable go at your project? And hopefully we get some positive thumbs up and we've engaged with our development community, and then we can advance a DCC bylaw to council for consideration and then to the inspector at the province for approval consideration. That DCC would likely look at, potentially, we haven't done all the numbers yet, but potentially financing, let's call it 75% of the expansion requirement of the plant. The remaining 25% would have to be financed from the municipality, and that would be a cost that would be borne by the existing users as well as other development that comes on later that we don't really know about, and we would recover those costs through latecomer agreements or front-ended DCC charges. And so realistically, I can paint a picture in my mind and put it on paper too, of how we can make phase 2 a reality without overburdening the broad tax base of the entire municipality and limiting the financing to the sewer area and new development. And that's the way I think it should be done. When we look at the growth projections and like the development potential and allocate appropriate cost charges, the bulk of that will come from development. And so I hear you. It seems hard to wrap your head around the numbers sometimes because of, well, how do we get 100 more connections into the sewer area? But when you start piecing them together, it adds up pretty quickly.
Okay, thank you. Allison and then Joyce. Allison, you still have a question?
Well, I'm just going back to, there's 3 things that are putting water into the system that are using up capacity. And I guess my first simple question is, has the inflow meter been installed?
We don't have a meter at the influent of the to the plant. We only have an effluent meter. That's something that we're.
The inflow meter was one of the things that was listed as needing to be done on the phase 1, and I just wondered if it had been done. So one could argue that that is a repairs and maintenance cost that belongs to the current system because it's good practice to have that. The other question, I guess, has to do with inflows. And if I'm understanding inflows there correctly, that's where people have hooked up their stormwater to the sewer system, correct?
That can happen, or it can be groundwater getting into sewer manholes.
But that's infiltration.
Infiltration and inflow are, there's 2 components.
So there's 2 different concepts. There's I and I. So
inflow is where rainwater is ingressing into your system, like where it's deadly obvious, like the downspouts that you mentioned, or there's like a manhole cover that's not on,
Yeah.
right? And so
It's
things like
not,
that.
though. It's not deadly obvious, you know.
No, but yeah. And then infiltrate, but there's two eyes, right? There's inflow and infiltration, right? And so, yeah, but there's those ones where it's more obvious, and then infiltration is more discreet and more dispersed and difficult to find. And that's where the system's cracked, or there's like, you know, from roots or joints or what have you. And but you know, I understand the municipality did do some I&I investigations in the past and did identify some places. And then
Well,
Patrick,
I guess I was trying to just clarify what was inflow, because if inflow is people who've gone and hooked up their stormwater or their roof runoff into their sewer system, that's not allowed under the sewer system bylaws. You're only supposed to. So is there any thought to actually trying to figure that out by requiring everybody to install a meter on their sewer outflow line?
that's
And measure that compared to their water.
Is that like
line,
getting a
and then-
vaccination?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
Anyway.
it's not fair for everybody to have to pay for somebody, you know, for 10 or 15 houses that are running running the equivalent of
Okay.
4 household, 10, 20 household water usage through their sewer system.
You know, maybe let's leave that thought with
It's
management
just-
and
that
for
was
somebody to
just
come
another
back to us too.
clarification I wanted to add.
Are you okay with Allison?
Yeah.
Thank you. Joyce? You're on mute still?
There we go.
There you go.
My comments are taking us right back to the emergency that's facing us. And when my family faces emergency financial situations, thank heavens we haven't had a lot, but we have had some. We have to stop and ask the question, what can we give up? I mean, that's how we get there. And especially when we're doing long-term planning, it becomes even more important that we take a look at what can we give up. And I am hearing that council is determined to go ahead with the community center. They've already gone ahead with the fire hall. But, and maybe our commitments are such that we can't stop and ask that question. But when we're looking at where is this money going to come from, we are also facing what are we giving up when we pull the money out of those various funds. And to me, it's not just an issue of whether we have the money, it's also what are we giving up. And I just want to be really clear that I feel strongly about that.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I too, Joyce, have been thinking of this notion, what do you give up? There's a huge funding issue, and a lot of it is the money we need is for environmental means. Like we clearly can't have discharge into the ocean that's compromised. And so we, in a sense, first and foremost, it's an environmental problem, but also, of course, it's a problem for the residents on Bowen that are planning new homes, as well as people living in new homes. And, one of the things that I'll just bring it up, but it's a difficult one, is, we're got this issue coming up again every year of the big payment to the Islands Trust. And that payment, I think in a lot of people's minds is important because it's a backstop. They're there as an extra protection on our environmental realm. And most of the other things the Islands Trust is doing is covered by Metro and the municipality already through huge staffing. So yes, one of the thoughts I had is if we're trying to find funds that we need for, I think, almost like an emergency fund, emergency basis, because the other thing I'm worried about is what if there's a huge washout on one of our water systems, and there's an emergency again. We need to suddenly pay $1 million or even $500,000 for road rebuilding and repairing that washout, and the water system doesn't have the funds. So the immunity is in the same jam in a way, because of course that's why we have the protection of immunity, is to provide us contingency or emergency backup. So I like Joyce, I think we need to start thinking of what we need to, be hard nosed in terms of where we're spending money and what we could give up.
Okay, thank you. And just a point that I want to reference is the fact of what we're talking about today regards to finance and funds. This is 2022 budget, which we have not actually been presented with yet. And so that is a point that might be addressed at the time in the budgeting process in terms of the timing of that funding. And so that's something to consider, and should maybe make a note to that effect overall. And I think the Island Trust thing has got all sorts of implications. And I think that's perhaps something for hopefully maybe something to be addressed soon, but I think that there's all sorts of factors involved with that. But it is a very expensive, it is a lot of money, and maybe something to be addressed this year, I think, overall. And I think to understand what taxpayers think is important as it relates to that relationship.
Yeah, certainly support that being a matter for discussion, whether it's in the short term, it remains to be seen, but it absolutely has to go on the agenda, because council, whether it's this council or the next council, will have to trim its wings. There's simply, everywhere you turn, there are infrastructure issues, and it's going to boil down, do you want to fix your roof, or do you want an ornamental garden in your driveway? So, yep, there's going to have to be some real hard-nosed, unpleasant discussions have to take place, whether it's people like me or others, and there's going to be no avoiding it because the money's plumb run out.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to bring us back to the matter at hand as it relates to the phase 1 and the financing around that. We have been in receipt of some financial information as it relates to our reserve funds, and certainly an estimates and unappropriated surpluses. And just as background, something the council didn't really have available to them the other night. And so to assist with the decision process, recognizing that they are estimates at this point and would not be published until year-end statements are done. And I think one of the questions I would have, and I think when you talk about emergencies, I think there are things you can do in a declared emergency, but for the purpose of what we're dealing with right now, I guess my question to Liam, because this has sort of gone in a different direction than I expected in terms of some of our comments, is are there, other than internal financing, which is really what we're doing, is we're funding it from our reserves and unappropriated surpluses as proposed and discussed at council. Are there any other financing sources that would be available specifically to phase 1? I think phase 2 is another discussion in the future. But I think right now the immediate point is, in terms of getting up to accessing the necessary funds, are there any other options at this point?
No.
I mean, okay, and that's kind of like the point. I think we're trying to say is, so if we recognize the current situation, I guess the question is committee interested in making a recommendation relative to phase 1 and also the exploratory work or planning that's required for phase 2 at this point, at this stage, based on the information that's been provided. There has been some assurance and that there are sufficient funds available within those reserves and surpluses to meet the requirements of what's being proposed right now. But it may very well require that we look with a very close eye in terms of the 2022 planning process, in terms of what's being proposed around capital and that sort of thing. So I guess my question is, are we in a position to look at that? Allison, then Joyce.
Well, just a couple of things. In Patrick's PowerPoint, he noted that if we use the money from the capital replacement and reserve fund, that some projects would have to be deferred. Now, those I assume are general island-wide projects or whatever that would impact. So to me, to be prudent and picking up a bit on what Fred's saying, we need to know what we're giving up. What are those projects that the Capital Replacement and Reserve Fund would have done, and what is their urgency, and that kind of thing. And then I guess the other is we have no operating results for 2021, so we don't know what money has been used already. I think there were a couple of resolutions that if there wasn't enough left in budgets, that it would be funded out of accumulated surplus, but I haven't had the time and I don't have the ability to search documents for a whole year by typing in accumulated surplus. So I don't know, we don't know what those fund balances actually are. And yeah, and then I guess the other, sewer outfall capacity issues clearly relates to expanded volume going through. What about the Waste Management Act? What's the issue with that? Is that the fact that the plant's overflowing and spewing polluted water out into the, so that's a current operational issue, not a future expansion of an issue because of making it bigger or adding more people.
Okay, I'm not sure to respond to that. I think you're dealing with provincial and federal regulations, and
yeah. So the outfall is the federal, and it's 227 cubic meters right now, and we've bumped up to that number maybe twice in the last year,
yeah,
looking at the spreadsheet. But the other issue with the provincial, there's some feedback somewhere. I'm hearing myself a second time. There's the waste management issue. I'm not quite sure I understand what's triggering that.
I'll ask Patrick or Liam just a quick response to that, please.
Well, the BC Waste BC Wastewater Management Regulation, we have a permit to discharge up to 227 peak day discharge, 227 cubic meters. That permit only allows us to discharge to the outfall. We've had, when we usually coincides with high rainfall, we've had days that the capacity's been exceeded. And so there's a couple of things that contravene our permit. One would be when it backs up and essentially overflows at the head of the plant, that our permit doesn't allow us to discharge anywhere other than the outfall. So, and it has to be a certain quality. So if the capacity's too high and we're trying to push too much through to avoid the backup, and the biosolids washout occurs in the bioreactors, then your effluent quality is going to be exceeding your limits. So those are the two sort of contraventions of our BC Waste Management Regulation permit that we're concerned about.
Okay, thank you. Joyce?
A point of order. I'm wondering if we're supposed to be in a closed meeting at this point.
Well,
or why are we having a closed meeting if not?
We had thought that we might move into a closed meeting, but the discussion has sort of evolved here in the open session.
Well, I would still like to move to a closed.
At this point?
Well, at some point, because there's more numbers we need to get into.
Okay, so why don't we suggest that we suspend our discussions and recognizing that what's been provided for information purposes thus far, and that we look to proceed to a closed meeting, sort of the blue sky, and to talk about some of the things. And if there are things coming out of that meeting, we will of course bring those into an open section. So we'll move to point 6. We'll move to a closed meeting. 6.1. Basically, there's a specific recommendation. I don't think we have to read it out in full. It's there in the agenda. Can I have a mover, please? Joyce, thank you. Seconder Allison. And so all in favor? Thank you.